You saw in the previous video, the astronomical sign prior to the rise of the Antichrist, prophesied in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1, was fulfilled in Constantine's sign in the heavens as recorded by Eusebius, in what is now believed to have been a meteor in 312 AD. You saw also that the prophecy concerning the key of authority from the abyss was fulfilled in the papacy's false claim. They had the bones of St. Peter in the catacombs, and cited as allegedly proving, Peter gave Rome their key of papal authority. And you saw how John's prophecy, that the well of the abyss would be opened up, was literally fulfilled in history, as the Vatican drained the necropolis to fill its baptismal pools with water from the tombs and crypts within Constantine's new basilica, that the new Roman Catholic converts were being baptized in. And, as the catacombs and tombs were robbed of their bones and carcasses, and spread across the empire, as coveted holy relics, randomly attributed to various saints, based on seizures and mystical revelations, obtained during necromancy sessions. And you saw that John's prophecy that smoke would come out of the well of the abyss, as if from a great furnace, was also literally fulfilled in the Vatican's well of bones, adjacent to its furnace complex, as reported by the Vatican's own doctrine of theology, Luigi Descantis, and in its use of the genocide furnace, throughout the Dark Ages. Thus fulfilling John's first 7 prophecies, listed in verses 1 and 2. And you saw how John pointed to the issue of necromancy, to expose the false claim this development had anything to do with, or was in any way serving, God. John will continue to point out the hypocrisies and contradictions of this coming new Roman army, throughout the rest of Revelation chapter 9 verses 1 through 11. As you will see again in the very next verse. Now, in this video, we are ready to continue going through the rest of the first prophecy concerning the first army of the Antichrist described in verses 1 through 11, beginning with verse 3. The transliteration of verse 3 reads as follows, quote, "And out of the smoke issued locusts into the land, and he gave them authority, like the ones having authority, of scorpions, of the land." End quote.
Hello, this is the law firm of Suamal, DeFrock, and DeBunkus. How may I direct your call?
Hello? Yeah, I want to file a restraining order.
Okay, could you give me just a little more information so I can connect you with the right attorney for your case?
Yeah, I'm being harassed and threatened, and I can't take it anymore.
I understand. And would you like to file a restraining order to bring an end to it?
Yes, that's right.
And who would you like to file this restraining order against?
Well, it's the ants in my front yard. I'm fed up with them, and I want to file a restraining order.
Excuse me? What did you say?
I said I want to file a restraining order against the ants in my front yard. And I'm thinking about suing them for damages as well.
Sir, is this a prank call?
No, I want to sue my ants.
Sir, you need to call a pest control company.
No, they don't issue restraining orders. I'm calling an attorney because I want a restraining order.
Sir, you can't file a restraining order against insects. I'm sorry.
Well, yes, actually I can. I read it in Revelations that the Antichrist is going to give authority to locusts. So it's obvious bugs can overstep their authority, and mine certainly have. They're completely out of control, so I'm filing a restraining order. Now that's in the Bible.
Sir, I'm not familiar with what you are reading in the Bible, but bugs do not respond to legal actions, and you certainly can't sue them, okay?
Well, see, you can if they're magic bugs, and I'm pretty sure mine are magical.
Why do you think your bugs are magical, sir?
Well, because they appeared completely out of nowhere. One day there were no bugs, and the next day they appeared. So they're magical. They came out of nowhere.
Excuse me, sir. I'm not familiar with what you are reading in the Bible. Sir, that's ridiculous. Either call a pest control company, or I will give you the number to a mental health facility, okay?
No, I don't need a number to a mental health facility. My bugs do not need mental health counseling. They need a restraining order.
Well, I'm sorry. We don't file court actions against bugs.
Well, then I guess you don't believe in the Bible then either, do you? I guess you're just some kind of new age heathen or godless liberal or something, huh?
No, actually, I'm neither. But I'm pretty sure whoever taught you to read that in the Bible is just plain crazy. Please do not call this law firm again, okay? Thank you. Goodbye, sir.
Oh, shoot, she was obviously a godless heathen, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. She gonna get left behind in the rapture, and her airplane is gonna crash for sure. Yep.
As you can see, it would be pretty crazy if someone wanted to file a legal action against bugs. Yet the way the Counter-Reformation teaches verse 3 is not any less credulous, as you will see in a moment. The attributes and functions of bugs in the Counter-Reformation scheme of eschatology are completely redefined with anthropomorphic human characteristics and magical powers, which not only violate all the known laws of biology and physics, but even the nature of bugs themselves. All in an effort to simply avoid the primary and most obvious focus of the text in verse 3. When people want to hide something that is already visible, the way it is done is through misdirection. You blow up or make such a big deal of a triviality or side issue that the obvious thing becomes eclipsed or obscured from sight. You will often see this technique employed by political parties and institutions, corporate public relations campaigns, con artists and even stage magicians. It is a very common tactic. Almost all the tricks used by stage magicians and illusionists rely on the tactic of misdirection. When most people are looking at one thing, they have a tendency to not see the other. In Revelation chapter 9 verse 3, that is precisely what Counter-Reformation theology has intentionally done with verse 3. They get the public to so focus on the two references to bugs that the rest of the entire text conveniently disappears from sight. They say, "Oh look, the bugs, the bugs, the bugs." All the while hiding the whole point of John's discussion, which is authority. Even if you had absolutely no idea what John was talking about in his reference to locusts and scorpions, as most people do, one thing is very clear from the text. John is not too concerned about those two references, and literally simply refers to them in passing, as though his audience is not only not shocked by his references, but already fully understands them. That would certainly not be the case if he were really discussing magical demon bugs. The actual focus of John's text in verse 3 is something else entirely. And it doesn't have anything at all to do with literal locusts or scorpion, magical bugs. And that is the part of the text Counter-Reformationists are hiding in plain view with their magic bug theology. Why is that? Because John uses 20 Greek words in Revelation chapter 9 verse 3. And out of those 20 words, John uses 11 of those 20 words, or over 50% of the actual text, describing the issue of authority. And he uses only a few words to introduce the bugs themselves. If John had been describing what the Counter-Reformation claims he was describing, he obviously would have spent a great deal more of the text actually talking about the bugs. But he mentions them virtually in passing, while the physical bulk of the text itself is actually all about the issue of authority. As you saw in the previous video, John pointed to the issue of necromancy surrounding the coming Luciferian potentate in verse 1 and his key of authority. But now in verse 3 John is pointing to another issue that will separate the community of the people of God from this coming Luciferian potentate, and that issue is the issue of authority, not bugs. It is in fact the issue of the kind of authority that the Antichrist will exercise that actually reveals who he is. And John is not introducing a new concept in his discussion of authority, he is repeating the very same prophecy written by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 concerning the man of sin and son of perdition. Revelation chapter 9 verse 3 is used by counter-reformationists to claim there are magical locust scorpion hybrid bugs living in the center of the earth in a bottomless pit, which then come out at the end of time and covers the whole earth. But anyone that can read this text and is honest with themselves can know for a fact that this text is not saying anything about these alleged magical bugs that live in the center of the earth and come out of a bottomless pit. Facts are not opinions or interpretations. Facts are simply facts. You either acknowledge and respect facts and consider them, or you invent excuses to simply ignore them. If you are a person who makes a practice of citing excuses to ignore facts in order to hold on to your religious opinions, then you are simply a dishonest person. The motivation for your dishonesty is irrelevant. There is no such thing as pious fraud, because fraud is not pious. It is simply fraud. In the scriptures, this phenomena is called a lying spirit, not pious fraud. As the expression is often cited, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, however they are not entitled to their own facts. Here are the grammatical facts of the text in verse 3. 1. The previous texts do not say bottomless pit. They say, well, of the abyss. 2. The texts do not say earth. The word is land in the Greek text, not earth. 3. And the language and grammatical construction of verse 3 make it perfectly clear the topic of discussion is actually the word authority, not magical bugs. After introduction of the term locust in the 6th word of the sentence, he goes on to focus on their authority, which he mentions 3 times in the 11th, the 13th, and the 15th words. The topic of verse 3 is about authority, and it is a major focus in that verse. Why would John be focused on the word authority if what he was discussing in the text were magical bugs? It would not be John's focus. And when the word scorpion is brought up, it is actually used only as a metaphor to describe the topic of authority, which is the focus of his discussion in verse 3. Because he uses the word like, indicating the use of a comparison only. He is still discussing the topic of authority. And there are 3 very important points to make here about John's discussion on authority concerning the locusts which come out of the smoke. The first point is, you don't have discussions of authority about locusts. There is nothing to discuss. Locusts are bugs. Nobody has discussions about the authority of bugs. And the Greek word translated as authority in our interlinear, and which is translated as the word power in the King James Version, is the Greek word exousia. And that is a very strange word to be using about bugs of any kind. Because that is a word that is simply not used about bugs, because it is not applicable, just as you saw in the cartoon earlier. Unless you actually believe it is appropriate to file a lawsuit against bugs. Because it is a term that has legal connotations. The very first 2 times this word is used in the New Testament, it is translated as the word authority, even in the King James Version. The first use is Matthew chapter 7 verse 29, describing Christ as one speaking with exousia, translated as authority. Naturally, Christ as the Messiah of Israel, and rightful heir to the throne of David, had legal authority to speak authoritatively. And Matthew notes that his manner of speech instinctively reflected that authority. And people who heard him speak noticed it. The second use, however, is a discussion between Christ and a Roman soldier, and the Roman soldier says that he is under exousia, or authority, and therefore knows what it means to take orders. The soldier was using that word in reference to the Roman Empire and his relationship to its legal authority. And the reason that word is used is because exousia has a legal connotation to it. It is not simply a reference to one's own innate ability to do something. that linguistic nuance is lost in the English translation of this word in the King James Version as the word power. You may have the innate power or ability to do something, but that doesn't mean you have the right or authority to do it. For instance, you may have the power to arrest someone, as in the innate physical strength or ability, but that doesn't mean you have the authority to do it. The Greek word, exousia, on the other hand, carries with it the idea of jurisdiction, delegation, legal right, and privilege. And these are qualities that are not descriptives of bugs. Bugs are not legally authorized to do anything, they simply are what they are. Nobody gives them legal authorization, or withholds it. Because bugs do not have the capacity to submit to human legal constructions. They do not make decisions. They are bugs. They cannot be authorized, or unauthorized, to do or not do anything, because they do not have the capacity to recognize human legal constructions. You cannot stop ants in your front yard with a legal injunction or a restraining order. You do not hire an attorney when you have a bug problem. Can you imagine the humor of someone calling up an attorney and asking a law firm to file an injunction or a restraining order against the garden bugs? You can neither give nor take away legal authority to bugs. The definition of the word authority is the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. These are all things that bugs cannot do. Unless, of course, they are imaginary counter-reformation magic bugs from the planet Krypton. But John is having an entire discussion, in verse 3, about the legal jurisdiction of locusts. And if you ignore John's own explanation in verse 7, that he is referring to a human army, as counter-reformationists actually do, then you are left with an insane text that defies explanation, requiring blatant appeals to medieval superstition and magic. The only explanation counter-reformationists can offer for the insanity of their rendering of this text is magic. The bugs are not just ordinary bugs, they are magic bugs. Magic bugs, who are busy taking legal authorizations and implementing engagement commands, and concerning themselves with their legal jurisdictions to do so. Which, of course, is patently ridiculous. The text makes it more than clear, John is discussing the issue of legal authority involving this coming new Roman army, which he compares to locusts, and clearly identifies as such, in verse 7. John says the Antichrist gave them authority, meaning legal jurisdiction or authorization. That means they have to have the capacity to receive that authority, and be cognizant of the fact it had in fact been granted. Remember the definition of authority again: to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. All three things, which bugs cannot do. The second point is, when you listen to counter-reformationists explain or illustrate this text, they merge the reference to locust with the reference to scorpions, as though it is referring to the same one thing. But it is clear in the grammar of the text there are two separate references being made. One is to the locust, and the second reference is only by way of comparison. In fact, every time John brings up the word scorpion in chapter 9, he does so clearly indicating he is referring to another entity by way of a comparison only. This fact is made very clear in literal translations from the Greek text and interlinears. As you see in Young's literal translation on your screen in verse 3, verse 5, and verse 10. In all three references, John uses the phrases as, and, like, when making the reference to scorpions. And as you saw in videos 12, 13, and 14, that was a reference to the Roman military and its signature weapon, the scorpion. The third point is, that he compares the authority given to them by the Antichrist to the authority of the ones having authority of scorpions. Here in this expression, counter-reformationists have another very big problem. When John uses this reference to authority, and compares it to the ones who have the authority of scorpions, he uses the present tense in the Greek, meaning he is referring to something already in existence and something to which his audience already knows. He is appealing to their current knowledge about something with which they are already familiar. Notice closely, John doesn't say, as the scorpions have authority. He says as the ones having authority of scorpions. And as you can clearly see in the language, there is a very big difference between the phrase, authority of scorpions, and the phrase, like, the ones having the authority of scorpions. That is a party or an entity that is separate from the scorpion. it is the ones having authority of the scorpions, not the scorpions themselves. Counter-Reformationists have no credible explanations for any of these facts in this text. Unless you wish to claim John is referring to scorpion farmers in 95 AD, you're left with no explanation for that distinction between the word scorpion and those who have the authority of them. John is discussing legal authority. He makes reference using personhood. He uses the present tense when referring to the scorpions, and refers to a second party other than the scorpions, which has their authority, using the present tense when he does so. And he is appealing to the knowledge of his audience, in his own day, in 95 AD, when making the reference to their authority, which his audience would be familiar with. And their authority is the primary focus of the discussion. And none of this fits anything the Counter-Reformation claims about their magic bugs that live in the center of the earth, in a bottomless pit. None of it. Unless of course you think it makes sense to file a restraining order against roaches or ants, rather than call a pest control company. Why is the issue of authority such an important issue in John's mind concerning the coming of the Antichrist? We are 3 verses into chapter 9, and in virtually every verse, John has been discussing the issue of authority. In verse 1, he compares this coming Luciferian potentate to the king of Babylon, who exalted the authority of his throne as equal to God in heaven. And John explains that the Antichrist receives his authority from a key, from the abyss, otherwise known as the Roman place of the dead. And that is how he gets his authority. In verse 1 he describes the origin and nature of the Antichrist's authority. Then in verse 2, he describes how the Antichrist uses this false authority to bring death and darkness to the world. And then in verse 3, John describes how the Antichrist extends his authority to an army that John compares to locusts. John is spending a lot of time on the issue of the authority of the Antichrist, and what he will be doing with it, where it comes from, how he gets it, how it is abused, and even how he extends it to a new military order. John is shining a light on the issue of authority because he sees in it the most obvious thing that will identify the coming Antichrist in 312 AD. And in verse 3, he points out to his readers that the authority of the Antichrist will be the very same kind of authority as those who now have the scorpions, meaning the most feared weapon of the Roman Empire. So in John's comparison of the locust army to the scorpion army, John is stating the locust army of the Antichrist will be nothing more than the continuation of the authority of the Roman Empire and its old Roman military order under a new leader, with some new names and new weaponry. Verse 3 introduces prophecies 8 and 9 on our checklist. Prophecy number 8 is, there will arise a new kind of Roman army, and prophecy 9, it will be given the same kind of authority as the army of the old Roman Empire. And now we will look at how prophecy 8 and 9, concerning the authority of the Antichrist, were fulfilled in history. Once you correctly identify verse 1 as the rise of the papacy under Constantine in 312 AD, everything else in the remainder of Revelation chapter 9 becomes almost self-explanatory. And once again, we are brought to the events surrounding the Edict of Thessalonica, wherein church and state were merged under Pope Damasus in 380 AD, and the army of the Roman Empire was brought into servitude to the papacy, under a Roman Caesar, who embraced New Testament Nicolaitanism, under the name of Catholicism. One of the most important legal instruments in the Western world involved the city of Thessalonica. You can study history all the way through your entire academic career, from first grade until college graduation, and you can even go to Bible college, or even seminary, and study theology, and never see it brought up in your classes. You can attend public and private schools, you can attend secular and religious colleges, and you can even do postgraduate work at a seminary for degrees in theology, and see it never brought up. There will often be no discussions about it in your class, no student reports due on it for homework, and no references to its effect on Western civilization, and yet it was one of the most important legal edicts ever issued. And And in terms of church history, or the history of Christianity, there was probably no more important and historically significant document in existence, other than the manuscripts of the New Testament, and most Christians do not even know it exists. Most Christians have never even heard about it. Pastors do not speak about it. Secular historians and history professors in secular universities are virtually silent about it. Bible college professors do not teach about it. Seminary professors do not even teach about it. And yet it was without doubt the most significant turning point in Western civilization. How do you just accidentally miss something that is as critical and profound as that? From all these subject matters? And, not only was it one of the most significant and profound legal instruments to ever be issued on earth in history, its coming was prophesied at least 3 centuries before it occurred, both by the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and here by John in Revelation chapter 9 verse 3. And yet, no one talks about this world-changing event, and most Christians have never even heard of it. The reason, of course, is that the Counter-Reformation prefers it that way. They would be very happy if no Christian on earth ever heard of the Edict of Thessalonica. Even if it had been prophesied by the New Testament apostles themselves. On February 27, 380 AD, the Edict of Thessalonica was issued, establishing the authority of the papacy and its religion, which it called Catholic, over the entire Roman Empire. In the latter half of the edict, the issue of authority is directly stated, as you will see in a few minutes. The edict reads as follows. Quote, "It is our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue to profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter, as it has been preserved by faithful tradition and which is now professed by the Pontiff Damasus and by Peter Bishop of Alexandria, a man of apostolic holiness. According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, in equal majesty, and in a holy Trinity. We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since, in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles the name of churches. They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven, we shall decide to inflict." End quote. In April of the year 390 AD, 10 years after the Edict of Thessalonica, upwards of 7,000 protesting citizens of Thessalonica were massacred in the streets of the city. The claims over what really caused this protest, and the subsequent massacre by the new Catholic army, have been completely fabricated ever since, and still are to this day. The explanations you will hear and read on the internet are all based on Rome's account only. All dissenting accounts, and records of the massacre, were destroyed. And this is how Rome's own historian, Theodoritus, described what happened, quote, "The anger of the emperor rose to the highest pitch, and he gratified his vindictive desire for vengeance, by unsheathing the sword most unjustly and tyrannically against all, slaying the innocent and guilty alike. It is said 7,000 perished without any forms of law and without even having judicial sentence passed upon them. But that, like ears of wheat, in the time of harvest, they were alike cut down." End quote. Thessalonica had received the letters of Paul, which today we have in our New Testament as the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which warn of the coming man of sin, who would be revealed in their city by a declaration of absolute authority over all religious matters, which did occur on February 27, 380 AD. Rome claims the entire incident was caused by hedonistic Thessalonians, protesting the arrest of a homosexual charioteer, which they idolized. But this explanation hardly squares with the fact that the city of Thessalonica was considered one of the most Christianized cities in the entire Roman Empire. Obviously, these two facts are not consistent with one another. And neither is the explanation of what happened by Rome. The same Rome who claimed they had the bones of Peter in their catacombs, under the Vatican. The Edict of Thessalonica was an obvious and direct fulfillment of biblical prophecy, concerning the rise of the Antichrist in Western civilization. But there are some other observations from an historical perspective which should be made concerning the Edict of Thessalonica, as well. The first observation that must be made is that the Edict of Thessalonica was a statement of absolute authority. There are 185 words in the edict. The first 97 words were a declaration of the basis of that authority. The second half of the edict is 88 words, and is a statement of the scope of that authority, and how they intended to enforce it, through state-sponsored, military-enforced violence. And this was the direct fulfillment of Revelation chapter 9 verse 3. In the first half of the edict, in stating the basis of their authority, they wanted to set forth what they considered to be the very strongest argument that could be made for their power grab of authority. And what they included and appealed to, as the basis of their declaration of absolute authority, came down to 2 points. First, they declared that Rome's new Nicolaitans Pontifex Maximus had actually received his authority directly from the Apostle Peter. And the edict makes a direct point of stating it was delivered directly to the Romans, in person by Peter. Not to all people of the world. Not to the Greeks, or even the Jews. But directly to the Romans, alone, specifically, the Romans. They claimed that the Jewish Apostle Peter came all the way from Judah, directly to Rome, in order to personally give Rome, and Rome only, his papal key to heaven. Which, as you saw previously, was a completely bogus and false claim, based on nothing more than necromancy, in Rome's catacombs. A claim to authority which was also directly prophesied, in Revelation chapter 9 verse 2, specifically mentioning that very same key is coming not from Peter, but from the abyss, where it actually did come from historically. And the second proof of Rome's right to this absolute authority, this new Roman Catholic religion, placing Rome's Pontifex Maximus at the center of the spiritual universe, was also believed by a bishop in Alexandria, who according to the edict, was a holy man. And therefore must be right, since he was so holy. And if you think about these two claims today, as the justification for their argument of absolute authoritarianism, in the manner of the Gentiles, as Christ himself forbade it, it is truly mind-boggling and tragically comical. Because their own stated justification to absolute authority is completely and totally void of any factual value, both historically and theologically. It was a completely non-historical bogus claim, based on nothing more than fantasies of universal Roman power, using Christ as an excuse to perpetrate the fraud. Anyone today can clearly see how inappropriate and erroneous, both historically and theologically, if not outright deceptive, these claims actually were. Peter had never been to Rome, precisely as the New Testament documents. And secondly, the word Catholic is Latin for universal. And the papacy was claiming they had the universal Christian religion, which for some strange reason, outside of themselves, was quotably, really only believed by a single bishop in Alexandria. That was the only other person, in the only other city, they could point to at the time, as clearly embracing the same fascist ideology, as Rome. What the edict doesn't say, is just as important, as what it does say. The edict doesn't say, Christianity, as is believed by all Christians everywhere, throughout our whole empire. It says, as is believed by Rome's pontiff, and by a bishop in Alexandria, Egypt, who is a really great guy. Which is quite amazing. And secondly, as you will see in a few minutes, it was no accident that that very same bishop in Alexandria did believe the same thing, because that is where many of the doctrines of this new Roman Catholicism and the papacy actually originated. Not the Apostle Peter, not Jerusalem, not Judah, and not Christ. But Alexandria, Egypt. Northern Egypt being the actual home of the Nag Hammadi Gnostics. From where these amazingly twisted ideas actually originated, in the Edict of Thessalonica. The first 97 words of the Edict of Thessalonica contains a number of blatant historical lies, which the Roman Empire was about to force onto the world, at the end of a sword, and with the threat of imprisonment or death. And of course, no one was going to be either politically or religiously free to debate their claim to absolute authority. The same kind of authority Christ himself had actually specifically forbidden among his genuine followers. The second observation comes in how they define this new Roman religion, allegedly received directly from the Apostle Peter, and what they are going to do if you happen to disagree with them. First, they claim that the Jewish Apostle Peter, called to the Jews, not only came straight to Rome, in complete disobedience to his own apostolic call, to personally give his papal key to the same Romans who had crucified Christ and murdered Jewish Christians by the thousands. They claimed he brought them his key, exclusively to the Romans, only, and if it were not ridiculous enough, they even claimed he also came as a full-blown, post-Nicene, Trinitarian. Another claim completely contradicted not only by the texts in the New Testament, but by what is fully known from history, which they claimed had been perfectly preserved by a tradition that didn't even exist yet, in Peter's lifetime. How do you know? Because they actually issued this claim right after holding a number of controversial church councils, in which the fighting was so intense at the councils themselves that it actually degenerated into physical violence. They claim that their Trinitarian Nicene Council Roman Catholicism, along with their papal key from the Apostle Peter, was a faithfully preserved tradition, was nothing short of bold-faced lying. What Rome was claiming was neither tradition nor preserved. It was a brand new form of heresy, invented by Rome, for Rome. It had no precedent among the apostles of Christ whatsoever. It did not originate with them, nor was it preserved from anything having to do with them. And the only other place on the planet they could even point to, in defense of that ridiculous anti-historical claim, was one bishop in Alexandria, Egypt. That was it. But it gets even worse than that. The edict also states that this law, and that is what the edict itself calls this new religion, a law. Anyone following this new law will assume the title of Catholic Christian, which of course is the introduction of a new word. Yes, the term Catholic had been used previously by the Nicolaitan Ignatius of Antioch, but it is not a term you will find used by any of the real apostles, including Peter, in the New Testament. There, you will find no such word as Catholic. But instead, you will find a very curious word, which is considered to be an antonym to the word Catholic. In the New Testament, the Jewish apostles were actually called prototes by Roman authorities, and prototes is a term related to our English word, protestant. It is the word Protestant which is found in the New Testament, not the word Catholic. And that term was coined by Roman authorities themselves to refer to real New Testament Christians over 15 centuries before it was used in the Middle Ages to describe Christians in the medieval Reformation. The edict itself makes reference to, quote, the others, end quote, documenting the fact historically that there were others who saw themselves as Christians, but others who did not embrace Rome's Trinity doctrine and would not take up the name Catholic. And those others pre-existed the Edict of Thessalonica, and their churches pre-existed the imposition of the name Catholic on the empire. But not only does Rome decree the title Catholic upon all its subjects, they also threaten any Christian group in the empire that refuses to adopt it, that their churches will be considered heretical and that people involved with them will be declared legally insane and treated as enemies of the Roman state, subject to any prosecution they would be in the mood, at the moment, to inflict. In other words, they give themselves a legal blank check to do whatever they felt like doing, no matter how severe or cruel it may be. Later in the Theodosius Codex, Rome will get more specific and spell out mandatory punishments that included having all their personal property and wealth confiscated by the Roman Catholic Church, and their pastors either imprisoned, exiled, or executed. So this was a declaration of full-blown genocide against, quote, the others, end quote. And in reality, historically, who are these others that are mentioned in the Edict of Thessalonica? They were the original Jewish Christian communities of the New Testament, of course. The same communities that had in their possession the prophecy found in 2 Thessalonians 2 and in Revelation chapter 9 verse 3. The same communities who were no doubt protesting in Thessalonica against that declaration of authority in the Edict of Thessalonica, and were slaughtered in the streets by the thousands. What Rome was really doing in the Edict of Thessalonica, was not faithfully preserving any tradition from Peter. What Rome was really doing was stamping the tradition of Peter out, by imperial decree, throughout the entire empire, as an act of law, which it saw as a competing and potentially threatening ideology. This is not a conspiracy theory, or an historical speculation, this is the statement in print, of what actually happened, explained by one of the Vatican's own, most prolific historical scholars, and authors. The Vatican has created a narrative about itself and the origin of its religion, issued by imperial decree, that was completely non-historical, and totally anti-biblical. And the Council of Nicaea is another very good example. If you read about the Council of Nicaea, what you will be told, is that Christian bishops were invited by Emperor Constantine, from all over the empire, to get a consensus of what Christians believed, and codify it, as Christian orthodoxy. But the fact is, there weren't any Christian bishops at Constantine's council, at all. In fact, real Christian bishops weren't even invited. There was not a single Christian bishop present at the Council of Nicaea. Not even one. Not a single one was present at Constantine's council. How do you know that? Because as you saw in part 10 of the series, which dealt with the bishops of Antioch, the people who define the meaning and use of the term bishop, as in Christian bishop, define the word bishop to mean an elderly married man with a wife, and grown children, who had successfully raised them, in an orderly fashion, and whose household was in order. Those were the requirements, in the New Testament community, and among the New Testament Christian apostles, in order to be a bishop. You had to be a married man, with a family. And historically, that was the same Jewish requirement, for leadership in the synagogue, at that time in history, that they were following. The Apostle Paul, the trained rabbi, was simply following the Jewish community's standard, for religious leadership in the local community. He was inventing nothing, in his descriptions about what constituted the qualifications for the work of a bishop, or episkope, as it reads in Greek. The Antichrist Nicolaitan, Ignatius of Antioch, taught things exactly reversed or opposite of the apostles. And thus in defiance of the original Jewish apostolic tradition, taught that bishops must not be married at all, they must be celibates. Within the Nicolaitan community, this became the standard practice, and in the year 306 AD, at a gathering of Nicolaitan bishops, called the Council of Elvira, this practice was codified into Nicolaitan law. The Council of Nicaea was convened in the year 325 AD, 19 years later, and virtually all its bishops held the title of bishop, because they were celibate. Meaning also, however, by New Testament standards, they were all disqualified, and not Christian bishops. They were in fact, the false teachers, prophesied specifically by Paul, in 1 Timothy chapter 4 verses 1 through 3. And Paul did not consider these teachers to be Christians, at all. Despite the claims he knew they were going to make. The bishops you will hear Rome talk about, and venerate as their saints are all unmarried celibate males, who are by definition, according to the scriptures, not qualified to be bishops in the New Testament. But they are, precisely, as the clergy of the Nicolaitans are described in the New Testament, both by John and by Paul. In fact, Paul goes even farther, and describes them in detail in 1 Timothy, and says their doctrine of God is a doctrine of demons, they traffic in seducing spirits, and forbid marriage among themselves. Just as the Nicolaitan bishops actually did. And that is what Constantine had gathered as his Nicene Council. They were celibate bishops, who followed Saint Nicholas and were the Antichrist Nicolaitans, spoken about in the New Testament, mentioned both in 1 John, and the book of Revelation, and prophesied about in Revelation chapter 9 verse 3, that we are now reading. And what Constantine was doing, with the Council of Nicaea, was not getting a consensus of Christian bishops at all, because there were no Christian bishops present at the Nicene Council. Constantine was consolidating his power base among the Antichrist Nicolaitans and their Antichrist bishops. And one very famous Nicolaitan, by the name of Saint Nicholas, was actually even said to have been personally present at the Council of Nicaea itself, which is known to be a complete and total fabrication, invented centuries after the council actually occurred. Nicolaitans habitually lied about everything, especially history. just as they are said to have been doing that in the New Testament, where they claim to be apostolic. But the fabrication that places St. Nicholas at the Nicene Council is a very important fabrication. Because from that mythology, you can see that St. Nicholas and his Antichrist Nicolaitanism was front and center at what was happening in Constantine's Nicene Council. It wasn't Christian at all. It was Antichrist Nicolaitanism. And they even wanted the patron saint of their movement, St. Nicholas, to be said to have been present. Because even if he were not literally there in the flesh, he was certainly there in spirit. Precisely as the mythology depicts. But the truth about what happened in these events goes much deeper than even that. You recall earlier how the Edict of Thessalonica cited two people as proof of the right to absolute authoritarianism. One was the Roman Pontifex Maximus, Pope Damasus. The other person cited, however, was Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt. So who was this bishop in Alexandria, Egypt? And why is he cited in the Edict of Thessalonica by Rome? Here are the facts about Peter of Alexandria. He was considered the head of the community in Egypt, which is claimed by Rome to have been Christian, but was actually nothing more than another anti-Semitic copycat Nicolaitan in Egypt, just like those that were found in Antioch. He invented the idea of doing mundane acts of penance to absolve one's guilt for doing evil things, such as saying a certain number of Hail Marys after you have lied, stolen something, or murdered someone. And other rituals such as standing and kneeling, or marking crosses over your chest, etc. These rituals were created as a result of a Christianized assimilation of many local Egyptian magic rituals. Or in other words, Peter of Alexandria was spreading belief in the power of Christianized Egyptian magic rituals among Nicolaitan Christians in Egypt. He offered this gimmick, which he named penance, to pseudo-Christians who had willingly denied Christ and worshipped Caesar during the persecutions, claiming it magically cleansed them from their betrayal. So the Egyptian magic rituals of penance, invented by Peter of Alexandria, became a very popular solution for many pseudo-Christians after the Roman emperor claimed he was now a Christian. And anyone who criticized the use of these cleansing Egyptian magic rituals, or failed to see the value of going through these invented mundane Egyptian doggy tricks, were called extremists and dismissed. But what had become extreme in reality was the level of assimilation with Egyptian paganism and magic that Peter of Alexandria was willing to go. Peter of Alexandria, who was also very anti-Semitic, naturally rejected the flesh of Christ in the Passover meal, as all Nicolaitans did, advocating instead the much more preferable pagan celebration of the Egyptian equinoxial Easter in its place. And if all that was not all pagan enough for you, he advocated the keeping of the pagan Egyptian Lent season as well, and marking the head with ash, indicating having been enlightened by the sun. He was very strict and forceful about hallowing the Egyptian Day of the Sun as a new holy day, demanding no work be done on it at all, rejecting the traditional Jewish Sabbath, which had been still observed by the original apostles in the New Testament in a reformed manner. In fact, Peter of Alexandria was very big on rejecting anything Jewish at all, often justifying his departures from apostolic New Testament practices by simply citing the fact it was done by Jews, therefore it shouldn't be done by his Christians. Even if it meant rejecting apostolic practices in the New Testament. Peter of Alexandria's intolerance for anything Jewish included his interpretation of Christ as well, which naturally became morphed into a more pleasant and less Jewish synthesis of the pantheon of local Egyptian sun gods, including both Serapis and Yaldabaoth, mentioned in other videos on this channel, which inspired many of his newly invented Egyptian magic rituals, included in his collection of things to be done for penance by his Nicolaitan Egyptian Christians. Peter of Alexandria had been a pioneer in synthesizing Egyptian magic ritual under the label of Christ for Nicolaitan Christian consumption, preying primarily on the guilt and fear of uninformed Christian apostates after the persecutions. Peter of Alexandria was not only a shining example of a common religious Egyptian anti-Semite, he was quite an accomplished prolific religious liar as well, which of course was another trait which was totally commonplace among Nicolaitans throughout the empire. He actually wrote a letter on a doctrinal position he was advocating, and went around telling people it wrote itself, and had magically floated down out of heaven into his hands, in order to force people to accept it. If they had given trademarks and copyrights to inventors in his day, he would have been the holder of hundreds of copyrights for many of the anti-Semitic religious practices that most people today simply consider Catholic. Precisely because of the Edict of Thessalonica, which acknowledged him as a source of much of their intellectual property in their edict. And that is one of the reasons why he is held up as a source in the edict. But Peter of Alexander was more than just an intense religious Egyptian anti-Semite, a creative inventor of Christianized Egyptian magic rituals, and a prolific liar. He was also the head of what Rome called the School of Alexandria. And that is very important as well, and another reason he is cited in the edict. As you saw earlier in video 16, Christ had spent his youth in Alexandria, Egypt, where he learned the Greek language and was taught from the Septuagint, or what was the authorized Greek translation of the Old Testament, which he actually quotes from in the Gospel accounts. One of the charges brought against Christ by the rabbis in the Talmud was that he was doing his miracles, not because he was the Messiah, but because he was using Egyptian magic. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, this accusation became a magnet for people seeking esoteric spiritual powers, and who accepted the rabbinical explanations in the Talmud for Christ's reputation for legendary miracles. Many people, especially those of the Nicolaitan persuasions, converged on Alexandria and northern Egypt, looking for Christ's hidden Egyptian secrets to miraculous powers. In Nicolaitan theology and esoterica, this area became a hotbed for Nicolaitan mystics and Gnostic magicians, seeking to learn Christ's rumored secret Egyptian knowledge of power. And the local Egyptians, seeking to promote the esteem and importance of their local community, did not mind feeding the rumor mills, to encourage the tourism business, and promote the influx of esteem, attention, and population growth. Because of this history, Alexandria, along with the whole area of northern Egypt and North Africa, became an important geographical link in what would become the empire's new religion under Constantine. In the beginning of the empire's Roman Catholicism, most churches were created by simply converting pagan temples and Roman basilicas to their new use as Christianized temples. The very first church building, however, ever built from the ground up, specifically to be a Christian church, was built by Constantine in the new city of Constantinople, which he named after himself. The building, which was nicknamed the Mega Ecclesia, or Great Church, was named the Thea Sophia, which is a rather odd name for a Christian church, because it means literally, the goddess wisdom. It was claimed that this strange title was a reference to the Virgin Mary, but Mary was never said to be a goddess in the New Testament. And while she was said to be blessed among women, she was never placed above women, and Christ made it clear that, when asked for preferential treatment because of the fact she was his mother, her standing was no different than anyone else, doing God's will. Outside this very first church, Constantine placed an Egyptian obelisk, and had the serpent, from the temple of Apollo, brought from the temple at Delphi and also erected, along with an actual pillar holding up a statue of Apollo, with Constantine's own face on the statue of Apollo. When the building was dedicated, in a public ceremony led by Constantine, he read a famous prophecy, not from the Bible, but from the Roman poet, Virgil's 4th Eclogue. Justice returns old Saturn's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Under thy guidance, whatso tracks remains of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from the never-ceasing fear. Only do thou, at the boy's birth in whom the iron shall cease, the golden race arise. The Roman Catholic historian, Eusebius, claimed this was all seen as a symbolical reference to the Virgin Mary and birth of Christ. But there are some serious problems with the interpretation of these things provided by Eusebius. Most notably, the statue of Apollo outside the church, with the face of Constantine on it. As you saw previously, this was the Greco-Roman deity that was directly referenced in chapter 9 verse 11 of Revelation. The strange name for Constantine's church, the Thea Sophia, was not really understood until a discovery was made by an Egyptian farmer in 1945. A clay jar, containing a collection of 52 ancient writings of sacred texts, which had been hidden from the world, were found. It would be 32 years before these texts were translated and published for the world to read publicly. They were a collection of texts, found and hidden by monks, at the St. Pachomius monastery in Egypt. St. Pachomius was the founder of Roman Catholic monasticism, and was connected to what is called today, the Desert Fathers. The only problem is, that these texts are not Christian at all. They are pseudo-Christian Gnostic writings, which garble numerous biblical references, into a mindless stew of Gnostic babblings, that sound like they were written by someone on an acid trip, or, who suffered from severe schizophrenia. The term, Sophia, is mentioned 98 times in the Nag Hammadi writings. It plays a major theme in its theology. 3 times the phrase, Great Sophia, or Mega Sophia, is used directly echoing Constantine's Mega Ecclesia, Thea Sophia, title for his church. And by Sophia, the Nicolaitans at St. Pachomius Monastery were not talking about the biblical Virgin Mary at all. Sophia is used to refer to the Gnostic androgynous mother of the universe. But she as a she, has sex with her own immortal man part, and together, within herself, they create the first begotten Son of God. And that is how they were interpreting Christ. And the meaning of the name of Christianity's first church, built by Constantine, titled in its honor, the Thea Sophia. The same Sophia, mentioned 98 times in the Nag Hammadi texts. The mysterious Catholic origins of the observance of Christmas are also made quite clear in these writings as well. In one text entitled, Thunder Perfect Mind, the author records Sophia speaking the following. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am she whose wedding is great and I have not taken a husband. I am the one below, and they come up to me. I am sinless, and yet the root of sin derives from me. For I am the wisdom of the Greeks, and the knowledge of the barbarians. I am the one whose image is great in Egypt. The solar deities of the Greeks, the barbarians, and the Egyptians were synthesized into a single deity, as Christ, and Sophia, as the mother goddess. And the nativity day, of all these solar deities was of course, around the winter solstice. And celebrated on December 25th, in the Roman Empire. Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, was the direct link between this Egyptian Gnosticism, found in the Nag Hammadi writings, and the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Caesar at the time of the Edict of Thessalonica was Theodosius. Augustine, who lived during this time, wrote in his book, The City of God, the following. Quote, Theodosius sought the advice of John, a servant of God who lived in the desert of Egypt. Popular opinion had it, and he heard, that this man possessed the gift of prophecy. End quote. This reference to the desert of Egypt was a reference to this very same community that possessed and venerated the Nag Hammadi texts that you just saw. The same that mentioned Sophia, mystical mother of the universe, 98 times in their writings. But that's not all these celibate Nicolaitans taught down in Egypt. In a text entitled, Origin of the World, they also taught the following. This is also the Sophia speaking. But her son is the begotten one who is Lord. Afterward the authorities called him the beast, in order to lead their molded bodies astray. The interpretation of the beast is the instructor. For he was found to be wiser than all of them. So, the Lord and the beast are secretly the same thing, and the only reason the beast is called the beast is because the beast is wiser than all, and is secretly the teacher. And he is only called the beast, to secretly lead them astray. So in other words, Christ and the Antichrist were secretly the same thing. And there is secret wisdom hidden in the Antichrist, and it is just called that to trick the unenlightened, and keep them stupid, and from knowing this secret wisdom. And this explains why the papacy actually began to intentionally adopt and intentionally duplicate prophetic symbolisms directly connected to the coming of the Antichrist in the New Testament. They thought it was a secret wisdom, to intentionally fulfill all the prophecies concerning the coming of the Antichrist. The only problem, of course, is that Paul prophesied that very thinking as a delusion 3 centuries before it even happened, not as a secret wisdom at all, but a delusion. And he also said that those who were complicit with it would suffer eternal damnation as a result of that very same delusion. The link to all this depravity and delusion coming out of Egypt was Peter of Alexandria, cited in the Edict of Thessalonica, and now you know why Rome's Pontifex Maximus cited Peter of Alexandria in the Edict of Thessalonica. And you also see what theology they were actually invoking concerning the subject of the Antichrist in their own edict. For centuries, whenever the New Testament was cited by Protestants to Roman Catholic priests, the priests would openly claim they had in their possession a secret oral tradition passed down directly from the apostles, but that it was extra-biblical. In 1945, with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, that secret oral tradition became public knowledge to the world, as well as its origins, and it most definitely, without any ambiguity, was not in any way passed down from the apostles. It came from delusional celibate, Gnostic Nicolaitans, in the Egyptian desert, fantasizing that they secretly knew everything in the entire universe, when in reality, they knew absolutely nothing, not even about themselves. The word, desposny, was a term used to describe Jews who had been related to the earthly family of Christ. After Sylvester was given the crown of Rome's Pontifex Maximus by Constantine, this is how the new Roman Catholic Church dealt with their existence. Former Jesuit priest and professor of paleography at the Vatican's Pontifical Biblical Institute, wrote in his book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, on page 44, quote, Sylvester curtly and decisively dismissed the claims of the Jewish Christians. He then told them the Mother Church was now in Rome, with the bones of the Apostle Peter, and he insisted that they accept Greek bishops to lead them. It was the last known discussion between the Jewish Christians of the Old Mother Church and the non-Jewish Christians of the New Mother Church. By his adaptation, Sylvester, backed by Constantine, had decided that the message of Jesus was to be couched in Western terms by Western minds on an imperial model. The Jewish Christians had no place in such a church structure. They managed to survive until the first decades of the 5th century. Most of them died by the sword. Roman garrisons hunted them down as outlaws. The rest died of starvation, not being able to purchase food. End quote. The complete and universal execution of every known blood relative of Christ was accomplished by the 7th century, along with all known Jewish believers. The same kind of Jewish believers, which were the actual authors of the documents we now call our New Testament today. And this is what was behind Rome's citation of Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, in the Edict of Thessalonica. The edict historically documents the rise of the Antichrist movement, the Nicolaitans, and its leader to absolute power in Rome, precisely as the scriptures had prophesied. And this is what the counter-reformationists intentionally hide from the public, in their comical bug stories, concerning Revelation chapter 9 verse 3. As you saw in earlier videos, in 1 John and Revelation chapter 2, John has already identified the group that will rise to imperial power in the Roman Empire as the Nicolaitans. They claim to be Christian and followers of Christ, and they even claim that they are apostolic, but John does not concede that they are Christian at all, and instead labels them very pointedly as Antichrist, citing the fact that they simply assimilate all things Roman, from the practice of pedophilia to observing the pagan Roman feast days dedicated to the worship of idols and demons, and all the while actually having the nerve to openly proclaim that they are apostolic, but at the same time, openly and hypocritically, reject the flesh of Christ in the Passover meal Christ had commanded his disciples to be observed, as his own flesh and blood. Counter-reformationists will always attempt to claim two opposite self-nullifying things when preaching their cover story concerning the Antichrist. On the one hand, they will claim the Antichrist is always future, or at least just around the corner in the present, but then, they will also attempt to claim the Nicolaitans have all passed away. But John makes his identification of the Nicolaitans as the group responsible for the coming of the Antichrist very clear in 1 John and in Revelation 2. If there are no Nicolaitans, then there is no Antichrist. You cannot have your Nicolaitan cake and eat it too. Nicolaitanism is without debate or question the theological home of the Antichrist in the New Testament. You cannot have one without the other. And it is no accident that counter-reformationists will always attempt to deny the existence of these two identities as mutually identical and dependent on one another, as they are presented in the New Testament. In 14 verse 1, John compares the rise of this Nicolaitan leader to the king of Babylon in the Luciferian text, in Isaiah 14. The criticism against the king of Babylon in Isaiah 14, which prompted the prophet Isaiah to compare him to the fall of Lucifer in heaven, was stated in the text in Isaiah 14 verses 13 and 14 as, quote, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation, in the sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." End quote. The sin Isaiah charges the king of Babylon with is that he makes his throne, literally, equal to God in heaven. This is the origin of the occult doctrine stated in the syllogism, as above, so below. Or in other words, if an egotistical narcissistic megalomaniacal evil potentate makes himself out to be God on earth, then he is also God in heaven. And of course nobody would be stupid enough to believe that, unless they were an egotistical narcissistic megalomaniacal evil potentate, and thus, why it has retained its status as a doctrine in occultism, rather than a publicly recognized belief. Most people are not stupid enough to endorse such a concept openly. But that doesn't mean it is not both believed and propagated, behind the scenes, in Western institutionalism, mainly through the very Counter-Reformation itself, is found in the Vatican and the Masons, which are in fact the modern theological descendants of the Nicolaitans in the New Testament. The Vatican being the seat of the papacy, and the Masons considering themselves for centuries to have been the modern incarnation of the Vatican's army, in the Knights Templars. This prophecy concerning the coming authority of the leader of the Nicolaitans, who would be given power over the Roman Empire, identifies a series of unique characteristics about his ascent. It names the fact he is given a key, and that key comes from the abyss, which was the Roman place of the dead, and that he would be like the king of Babylon, in his sin, in exalting his throne, is actually equal to God. Citing that same behavior prophetically, exalting himself over everything that is worshipped or called God, Paul referred to this entity as the man of sin, in 2 Thessalonians 2. Citing the very same sin as was committed by the king of Babylon. He also referred to him as the son of Apollyon, meaning perdition or destruction, which was another word play on the name Apollo. In Revelation chapter 9 verse 3, we see not only does he equate his throne to the throne of God, he enforces his authority through the use of military action. In the scriptures, the way the pagan Gentiles in the empire related to human authority, in the absence of God, was noted and condemned by both the Old Testament prophets, the New Testament apostles, and even by Christ himself. Christ's condemnation of Gentile authoritarianism, or what is known as fascism today, is explicitly stated and openly condemned in all three synoptic Gospels in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 20 verses 25 through 28, Christ says, quote, "Jesus called them unto him and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many." End quote. Christ, noting the use of authoritarianism among the Gentiles, says point blank, quote, "It shall not be so among you," end quote. That was a non-negotiable unconditional command. It shall not be so among you. It was not a casual suggestion to simply think about. If you follow Christ, authoritarianism will not be found among you. Period. End of story. So obviously, if you create an entire military-industrial complex empire, based on Gentile authoritarianism, that Christ actually and directly condemned, it would be pretty contradictory and hypocritical to attribute such a blatant contradiction as something belonging to, or started by, Christ. But that is precisely what the coming leader of the Nicolaitans was going to do. In Mark 10 verses 42 through 45, the following is written, quote, "But Jesus called them to him and saith unto them, Ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. But so shall it not be among you, But whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister, and whosoever of you will be the chief shall be servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Once again, we see the very same explanation, reiterated a second time. In Luke chapter 22 verses 25 and 26, the issue is addressed again, quote, "And he said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. And they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors. But ye shall not be so, but he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. And he that is chief, as he that doth serve." End quote. Christ is explicitly clear, the Gentiles exercise authoritarianism, domination and lordship over their people, but anyone claiming to be following Christ will not be exercising authority, like the Gentiles. He openly, unconditionally, overtly and specifically forbade it. Point blank. Among his disciples. For the very reason that it is spiritually dangerous. And Christ certainly would not have endorsed any disciple, including Peter himself, acting like the Gentile king of Babylon, exalting his throne as even equal to the throne of God. And yet, when we look into history at the rise of the ruler of the Nicolaitans, to the throne of Rome's Pontifex Maximus, that is precisely what we find. In fact, this is what Christ even said about Peter in that regard in Matthew chapter 16 verses 22 and 23. When Christ was explaining to his disciples that it was the will of God that he go to Jerusalem and be crucified, this is the exchange between Christ and Peter that took place. Quote, "Then Peter took him, and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." End quote. Christ described Peter himself as satanic, and the reason cited was that he had his mind on earthly power, rather than the will of God. And that was all Peter himself had to do, to become completely satanic. How much more would this be true about the Nicolaitan Antichrist seeking the power of the Roman Empire? And the Apostle Paul says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that it is the claim to absolute authority that actually reveals this man of sin, or son of perdition as Paul calls him. He is prophesied to exalt himself above everything worshipped or called God. And that very declaration of authority itself would be what reveals him as the man of sin. John repeats this warning in verses 1 and 3 of Revelation chapter 9. In verse 1 comparing his use of authority to the king of Babylon, and in verse 3 comparing it to that of the Roman Caesars, in the phrase, like those having authority of scorpions. A reference to the Roman military weapon used to bring fear and terror into the hearts and minds of Rome's enemies. The king of Babylon's sin was, quote, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." End quote. And John is pointing to the issue of Gentile authority, to draw the distinction between the coming Luciferian rule of the Nicolaitan Antichrist, and the authentic apostolic message of the kingdom of God. And amazingly, just as John prophesied, here is what the papacy said about itself, after coming to power, in 312 AD, and being given the crown of Rome's Pontifex Maximus. Quote, "The Pope and God are the same, so he has all power, in heaven and earth." Quote, "I am in all and above all, so that God himself and I, the Vicar of God, hath both one consistory. And I am able to do almost all that God can do. I then being above all, seem by this reason, to be above all gods." Quote, "No prince, that the vicars of Christ, the popes are above the judgment of mortals. And that the most powerful sovereigns, have no right to punish the crimes of popes, how enormous soever they may be, for no matter how scandalous or criminal may be the debaucheries of the pontiffs, you should obey them, for they are seated on the chair of St. Peter." Quote, "Fear then, our wrath and the thunders of our vengeance, for Jesus Christ has appointed us with his own mouth absolute judges of all men, and kings themselves are submitted to our authority." Quote, "The Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal. He alone may use the imperial insignia. That of the Pope alone, all princes shall kiss the feet. His name alone shall be spoken in the churches. This title Pope is unique in the world. It may be permitted to him to depose emperors. No synod shall be called a general one without his order. No chapter and no book shall be considered canonical without his authority. He himself may be judged by no one. And the Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity. The Roman Pontiff, if he have been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter. The Pope cannot make a mistake. Quote, "We may according to the fullness of our power, dispose of the law, and dispense above the law. Those whom the Pope of Rome doth separate, it is not a man that separates them but God. For the Pope holdeth place on earth, not simply of a man, but of the true God." Quote, "Anyone who attempts to construe a personal view of God, which conflicts with church dogma, must be burned alive without pity." Quote, "We declare, say, define, and pronounce, that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature, to be subject to the Roman Pontiff." Quote, "Thou Pope, art our shepherd, thou art our physician, thou art our governor, thou art our husbandman, thou art finally another God, on earth." Quote, "But to believe that our Lord God the Pope, the establisher of said decretal and of this, could not decree as he did decree, should be accounted heretical." Quote, "We popes, hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty." Quote, "Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom." End quote. As you can see, it is the teaching of Rome, that their Pontifex Maximus should be obeyed and followed, even if he is the Antichrist. And obviously, that is a teaching you will find nowhere in the scriptures at all. In fact, the warnings are quite to the contrary concerning following the Antichrist. If you follow him, meaning either worshipping his God, or taking his mark, no matter who you are, you will be damned. Unconditionally. That is the actual teaching of the apostles on that question. And there are no exception clauses presented in those warnings. And the very same warnings about this are given by Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, that are given by John in Revelation 9. Verbatim. So, as you can see, there was something very obvious and unique about the use of authority by the rise of the papacy, precisely as John prophesies in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 and 3. And you can also see why it was so important to the Counter-Reformation to actually go so far as to lie about these texts, in order to hide their true meaning. Which to a Roman Catholic or Counter-Reformationist is even more important than anything the real apostles might have even written themselves. Unconditional belief in the absolute infallible fascist authority of the papacy is the cornerstone of the Roman Catholic Church even today, which Counter-Reformationists are serving to bring all Christendom into subjection to, even if it means lying in the name of God, and openly and knowingly serving the Antichrist, to do it. And that is why this belief in this Gentile use of authority is so dangerous, and identified by both John in Revelation 9, and Paul in 2 Thessalonians, as the premier prophetic marker and revealer of the real Antichrist. In the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, these ideas were made the law of the Roman Empire, and enforced by a new military, under what is called today, a Christian emperor. Which in fact, was not. But rather, it was the rise of the Antichrist to power, in Western civilization. Precisely as John had prophesied. All these ideas, laws and declarations, are still in effect today, in Papal Vatican states across the world, from Europe to Latin America. And after the merger with the Church of England, from the British Empire, that system of thought, which is described in the New Testament as Antichrist, actually covers the majority of nations in the world today. Quote, "Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom." End quote. And that is precisely what the Christianity of the post-Reformation, New World Order, today, has done. It has calmly laid down its head on the Antichrist. And all the pseudo-Christians, along with all their false Counter-Reformation Protestant Masonic preachers, who have followed, are destined to spend their eternities with the biblical Antichrist and his angels, that they have chosen to follow, all the way to Gehenna. At least according to the New Testament, and its apostles. You have seen in this video that John's prophecy concerning the exaltation of the throne of the Antichrist, like the king of Babylon, did in fact occur after 312 AD historically, in the rise of the papacy to power, in Rome. And you saw how that authority was literally based on an actual key, from the abyss, which they claimed were the bones of St. Peter, in their catacombs, thus proving they had the papal keys of St. Peter. And you saw that same authority was used to authorize an army to enforce the rule of the Antichrist on the whole Roman Empire. And how the papacy actually went so far as to promise its soldiers eternal life for the service to the Pope for killing non-Catholics. And this fulfilled Revelation chapter 9 verse 3 in history. Most Christians do not realize that the claims of the papacy to absolute authority are virtually unique on earth, and they are not rivaled by any other religious or governmental office on the planet, nor in the history of the world. And this very fact is what the apostles themselves in the New Testament pointed to as the single most outstanding feature of the Antichrist. Counter-Reformationists, who wish to tell you all the material in the book of Revelation is future, have to make that claim by actually hiding and censoring the history of what has already happened, and what is really written in the actual Greek language of the texts in Revelation. Because they know, if you knew what they were hiding from you, you would see them for who they really are, and you would also realize the extreme danger of their religious deceit. In the next video, we will continue the exegesis of Revelation chapter 9, moving on to verse 4. Thank you for watching.